All right, let's get started. And before we dive into the discussion, I thought we could do a little bit of like hands-on stuff. So what we just read is one of the main scaling techniques called roll-ups. And if you actually want to see a site that uses a roll-up, the one I've visited so far is called ideamarket.io. It uses the Arbitrum roll-up technique. Um, but the experiment I want to encourage you all to do is trying something called a side chain. So a side chain is a slightly different strategy than a roll up. But if you go to chainlist.org, the link is posted in both blockchain governance and voice meta. It'll show you a list of chains you can add to your MetaMask wallet. And one of them is the Gnosis chain, Gnosis. So search for that if you don't see it and add that chain to your MetaMask. And once you do that, switch to that chain and make sure it shows up okay. And if you would like, you can post your address on that chain, which will be the same as your Ethereum address. Post it in the blockchain governance channel, and I'll send you a little bit of XDAI. And XDAI is the uh, stable coin used on that network for extremely cheap and fast transactions. So that'll be our little experiment with sidechain transactions. But yeah, let's talk about scaling in general and this particular thing about rollups. So prompt is just your general comments on what you understood about the scaling problem and rollups in particular, and yeah, your reactions to sort of the technological state of affairs. So let's start with Brian, since Anuraj is uh, in silent mode today. So Brian.
All right. I think technically, like I kind of broadly understand, like a lot of it is very specific and technical in ways that I'm not particularly interested in understanding, and I know that others here will probably pick up that slack. One thing I was like a few things that came to mind as I was reading in a couple questions is like a lot of this reminds me of like escrow in contractual things or like when you have employer provided healthcare insurance and you kind of are part of a larger pool that's negotiating with uh insurance providers, and that kind of made me think of a lot of like the Coasian theory of firm things, and just um I guess brought me to questions of like and I'm not sure if there was an article that answered these questions. If there was, point me in the right direction. But like, are these level 2 pooling mechanisms like formal entities, like you have to, basically like negotiating with an insurance company or financial institution or something, where all of a sudden, in order to scale this decentralized technology in ways that are actually useful for most people, do we have to give up some of that autonomy to an entity um, that has a little bit more control over what happens in order to efficiently interact with the blockchain? Because then it kind of, to me, defeats a lot of the stated purpose of a lot of the DeFi Web3 stuff. Um, I think that's kind of all I have. That was kind of the big thing I took out, was just that question. So pass it on to Commits.
Hey, thank you. Um, I'm honestly still wrapping my head around all of this, and I I suppose what I find interesting here is, so there's this like, rhetoric isn't the right word, but there's this idea that if um, both like at the formal level of the protocol on the L1, with the sharding, and also in addition to the sidechains and the L2s, and the rollups, that eventually it'll be possible to produce both like enough like throughput, but also like enough like offloading of activity into sort of domain specific activity. So for example, like the sidechains could have, like, with the networking effect that they have right now, particularly like with Polygon and games that are, you know, built using the blockchain. A lot of them in the Ethereum ecosystem work on Polygon, and they even had like an issue about a month ago where one of the games on the network was like overburdening the sidechain. But the point being that like these sidechains will become like, they'll have like their networking effects, and so like certain kinds of domains or activities will tend to gravitate towards them, and so you get this almost like you have both this like balkanization of like activity, which could potentially be deleterious for the overall network, but you also have this like idea that like if you have more throughput, if you have all of these like scaling solutions in place, that will be like a satisfactory solution to the usage issue. And I'm skeptical that that's actually the case. I think of like a network like Solana, which I think we discussed last week. It it was having network congestion, and it already has very high throughput on the network. And that's because there's a lot of bots that are spamming the network. And because there's I'm really trying to find like a nice way of formalizing this, but I suspect that like in a certain sense, like the the threshold will always be met, and the network will always still somehow become congested, regardless of how much scaling there happens. Both like because more people are going to end up using it, but also because like just like the fluidity and the rapidity of the transactions are able to increase, and thus new types of activities happen on the chains. And so um it it feels like, and I don't know what it is, but it feels like there's like a more fundamental issue of like how to temper the tendency to saturate the network on a blockchain. And is scaling solutions really just like these like minor kind of like pressure releases, but really like as soon as like the release is kicked in, like, you know, all like everything comes in to fill that space. And I know that like this isn't like the end all be all of like the kind of overall solution. There's like other things about like how long does the memory stay stored, and like, you know, the mempool. So there's other components, but I just wonder like if there's this inherent way in which like the network um, tends towards congestion, regardless of like how scalable it becomes. Uh, Grigori? In case you didn't hear me, I'm passing to you, Grigori.
All right, looks like Grigory may be off his computer or something. Let's move on to. Oh, he's back. Okay, here he is.
Good day. Can you hear me? I am
Yep.
on mobile today, and it's really awkward for me to talk. So I will stay in listening mode only. Sorry about that.
Okay, let's move on to Jenna then.
I was going to stay in audio only, listen only, but I will say these the nitty gritty of how this works is, I'm really glad to follow along behind so that I have a picture of how it works, but I'm not going to be very helpful in actually making it work. I think that was something like what Brian said. I will pass to Mayor, who probably will be good at digging in. See ya.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence. I'm feeling a bit cheated when I read this. We were promised a distributed, reliable ledger which is going to change the world. Then we hear about, I'm just quoting, as computation is a slow, expensive part, we can offer up to 10 to 100 time improvement in scalability. Okay, that doesn't sound like a lot. And then they start talking, and I watched the video. Oh yeah, we need to validate. Maybe somebody's cheating. The whole point here was to build a system where people wouldn't cheat. And it seems like the promise is big, but there's, I don't know, too much stuff happening on the back end. Maybe there should be a different solution, which is more reliable, more scalable, and much less fidgety. That's my takeaway from this article. I mean, when I read something like, oh, we can reduce a transaction from 32 bytes to just 4 bytes. I thought we were in 2022. If it said from 32 gigabytes to 4 kilobytes, that would mean something to me. So that's my main comment upon reading this article. So I'm passing it to Nathan.
So I think I mostly came away with this with two big questions, one around the optimistic rollups and one around zero knowledge rollups. From the optimistic rollup side, the fraud challenge mechanisms seem, and I think I would just need to dig into the more technical side a little bit more, a little undefined to me. It feels like generally when you're doing spot things, you don't necessarily want people challenging directly, but you kind of want a random selection to be challenged, of transactions to be challenged. And maybe that's what's actually happening. It just wasn't at all clear from the reading that that's the case. I mean, overall, like the zero knowledge rollups, it seemed to be like the better solution. Like even though the reading tried to be very even-handed between the two, like it's just really the benefits of that approach seem to just really outweigh the benefits of the optimistic. So I'm kind of curious, is it just like because optimistic came first that there's still some investment in it, or like what is maybe the big barrier to zero knowledge rollups? I was a little surprised that the size of the address space is so much smaller on the zero knowledge the ZK chains, and I think that was what Mayer was talking about. But I will say that Mayer, I think if I understand it correctly, it's not when it was talking about the move from a 32 byte to a 4 byte. That's talking about the size of the address space and not necessarily the size of the data posted. And since, so a 4 byte is 24 bit, that's a 24 bit address space. So it's, we can look at it and say, well, we're moving all to 64 bit address spaces, but it's still quite large, but it's certainly not a 32 byte address space, which is like 256 bits. So I do kind of wonder, like, is that address space limit capping the size of ZK, of the sidechains using ZK rollups, which would be good to know and understand. I think it may be just I'm a little more optimistic. It doesn't strike me as weird that computation is actually the expensive part of things here. And it also doesn't seem necessarily like detrimental that it is. Like, especially if we think of the ledger as like primarily about data storage and not about computation, which kind of, I'm just having this idea right now, makes me wonder if maybe the right approach for some of these things is like a computation-based side chain that is then sort of using mainnet almost like long-term storage or something. Mainnet is ROM, and L1 is ROM and L2 is RAM or something. Probably better to think about that in terms of processor cache, but still. So those are my thoughts. Mostly, fraud mechanism seems weird and optimistic rollups, and the significant reduction in the size of the address space for ZK side chains seems also a little weird and potentially limiting. And I'd just be curious to learn more about both of those things. So on to Patrick.
Thank you, Nathan. So looking at this, I guess I would need a couple more examples. I had a friend who was developing on the Stacks chain, which is sort of an L2 for Bitcoin, but sort of similar in that when you're building a decentralized application. And he was saying that the way Ethereum was doing these rollups, it made it more difficult to audit in terms of what was actually like in the data. So I would be curious to like dig into like a specific example and how this is being implemented. But in terms of all the general stuff, I was like, sure, sounds good, sounds interesting, but don't have a super informed opinion. And that is it. Venkat.
All right. So yeah, I'm also still wrapping my head around all this, and especially if you go try hands-on on how this stuff works, it shows you how much of a frontier state we are in. I originally actually planned to have us do like a bridging transaction experiment, which I did myself for the first time last night. But that's like janky enough. I thought we should defer it. So bridging transaction is where you move tokens from one chain to a compatible chain using something called a bridge. And I moved the DAI token to the Gnosis chain where it becomes XDAI via a bridge contract last night, and it was kind of like fiddly and messy. So we'll do that some point in the future, but that's how I ended up with XDAI that I was able to send to you guys. But okay, so general comments, sort of quickly responding to what others have said first. What Kamit's mentioned, that reminded me of like a well-known economic phenomenon called Jevons paradox, where lowering the price of a commodity increases demand. So it doesn't actually sort of alleviate whatever problem you were expecting to solve. So that's Jevons paradox, and that means the problem stays bad because it gets cheaper, more people want it, so the problem gets bad again. But that's actually good, because if at a certain quality of service you could only serve 10 people and now you can serve 10 million people, that's progress, even though now 10 million people are frustrated in a way that only 10 people were frustrated before. So that's one comment I had. And there's also another less related phenomenon called Brace paradox in Graft theory, which is a result that says something like if you take, like, say, a road network in a city and you want to like relieve congestion, and you add like say a connecting path between two hotspots, and you think that'll relieve traffic, it makes it worse. And it's kind of like a more mathematical topological version of Jevons paradox, partly because it changes traffic demand, partly because the new way traffic is flowing might actually screw things up. So even though it looks like you have more capacity, you have less. So all these things are interesting to think about. Also, a response to Mayor's comment, I think the whole sort of, I don't know, discourse pattern of we were promised X and then we got this less disappointing or more disappointing thing, Y, it's kind of like a pattern in the history of technology where when it's early days, especially the non-technologists who are kind of like doing the evangelical stuff around it. They kind of spin a utopian narrative around it, and then when you actually hit the technological growth and scaling paths which exist with everything, you end up realizing that the utopian dreams were kind of bullshit, or kind of always bullshit. And then you go back to a more pragmatic stance and then ask, what does this really get you in terms of progress? So in the case of Web3, it was kind of interesting because even if you look at Satoshi's original Bitcoin white paper, even there's like a hint of utopianism. So here it actually started from day one, but it's always been the case. And if you look at all the Web3 rhetoric, like, the stuff written by the VCs, like Chris Dixon has written a bunch, they kind of do this unfortunate thing that's very popular, but then backfires because it makes for good, interesting clickbait articles to say something like, hey, Web 2 is super centralized and this is the brave new revolution against centralization, and we will do the decentralized libertarian extreme. And yes, makes for a popular article, but then when you go look at the actual technology, you realize that while it has increased the level of decentralization a lot and done a lot of interesting things, relative to what you promised, which was this radical decentralization, it looks like there's still too much centralization left. And then the critical crowd, the backlash crowd, they come back and act like, the fact that there's any decentralization at all in the solution, or sorry, the fact that there's any centralization left at all in the solution is some sort of moral failure. And then they're like, haha, you said decentralized, and therefore, because there's a centralized component to what you say, what you're actually building, the whole thing is a lie and a failure and a scam. And this, by the way, was the pattern of the article that did the round a couple of weeks ago by Moxie, who's the founder of, I think Signal. So really smart guy, and I really liked that article. It made a lot of the right criticisms, but it fell into this rhetorical trap of, because the utopians who kind of overpromised early were talking about like a pure decentralized paradigm, any centralization in the actual existing technology is a moral failure and therefore to be criticized as like this whole thing is wrong. And yes, if you look at sort of the complete details of what Moxie walks through, there's like points of centralization all the way in. But the larger point to realize is that if you compare to something like, say, Facebook or Twitter or something, this is genuine progress. Like layers of stack have been added that are like super decentralized, and you can do things that you simply could not do with any Web 2 technology. Like take authentication. We sign in with our wallets now. With something like Facebook sign in or Google sign in or like OAuth, it's all completely sort of like much more primitive and centralized. So that's something I like to keep in mind. Something like Jevons paradox, that as a technology grows, you will have these sort of weird scaling paradoxes. Ignore the utopians and look at pragmatically what actual progress is being made on the stack. So I like to think in that terms. And the third thing I like to think of is there's this line by, I forget who it is, the famous science fiction author, but it goes something like, the job of the science fiction author is not to predict the automobile, but to predict the traffic jam. And this to me is the interesting part. The blockchain is just the automobile, and it lends itself to like utopian visions. You just think about the blockchain, you'll think about like, Ayn Randish libertarian utopia kind of visions. But if you think 2 or 3 degrees out and you start thinking, all right, if that's the automobile, what are the traffic jams? Then you really immediately get into this scaling challenges and stuff. And I think that's a lot of fun. And what I've read so far and what I've understood of it, it seems technically super interesting. I really like all the stuff that's going on in the core Ethereum development. There's the sharding thing that's going to happen, and it's getting more so with the proof of stake switch. I like side chains. I like rollups. And the metaphor I've been thinking of is, side chains are like a service road next to a major highway, and there's on-ramps and off-ramps to the service road, and that's like bridging technologies. Rollups are more like HOV lanes. So this might be an American thing, but high occupancy vehicles. So there are special lanes in the main highway that are dedicated to people driving cars with more than one person, so 2 or 3 or more. So that's kind of the high occupancy vehicle is kind of a roll up, and they get special treatment. But there is a little bit of like complexity in merging back and forth from the HOV lane to the main lanes, especially when you want to enter or exit the highway system altogether. So this, I think, is inevitable. When you start with a primitive technology, like, cars first came online and they were just using cart tracks for like horse-drawn carriages. Then they realized cars could move much faster, so they made highways. Then they realized within highways you need service roads and on-ramps and off-ramps. Then they realized that efficiency and gas usage is a thing, and therefore to incentivize high occupancy, you have to make HOV lanes, right? And then they realized trucks are a larger vehicle, and they might have trucks only lane. Then they had toll roads. So all these things happened with road transport. But if you were like a car utopian in like 1890 and said that, hey, if you do anything other than just drive anywhere you like with no rules or like new structures at all, it's a failure. That would be, I think, a weird way of looking at it, because car technology, as it expanded, it created more demand, and the infrastructure and scaffolding also expanded accordingly. But it did decentralize transportation a lot compared to the rail network, for example. So anyway, so sorry for going on for a long time, but those are my random thoughts. So we can continue discussing for maybe 5-10 more minutes, and then I have a couple of proposals that I'd like us to briefly discuss. But yeah, floor's open for more comments.
I just want to jump in just because, Venkat, as you were talking, it kind of put me in mind of something, which was, in terms of this being the early days, and you made specific reference to, just signing in through wallets versus Google, Facebook logins as a huge decentralization win. And this is something that I've actually finding more and more interesting, is sort of the identity aspect and the moving identity sort of to the periphery of the network. And maybe this has kind of just been on my mind because, my first big task when I moved into my current job was migrating a whole organization to Okta, and so it was like totally thinking about identity in networks and in applications with that. But that move, like if that's the only thing, like if every blockchain fell away, but it became a wallet-like technologies became like the way we handled identities, and that was what came out of this technological moment. It seems to me that would be like really a huge improvement on a lot of things, and people being able to mix and match and create new identities. And I think it's notable that there are solutions like that are not necessarily blockchain. Gemini's login solution, it's not a wallet, but it rhymes. The way they use public-private key certificates in the same kind of fashion that a wallet uses for login. So I think it's interesting. Like there's almost a wasn't it Young who had the whole thing with the collective unconscious, and people work on this. Different people came up with the same solutions. Like it feels like there's a lot bubbling up in this space, and blockchain is one of those things. But like there's a lot of people thinking about these things, and I don't know. It's like just some of those little wins, I think, maybe are a lot bigger than people tend to think.
While we're waiting for more comments, Anuraj, can you browse to the ideamarket.io link that I posted in blockchain governance so people can see it on the recorded stream? And let's see. And also colony.io. So if you can. So for those of you who signed up on the X diagnosis chain, and I sent you some XDAI, please go to colony.io and create a profile there. So that can be your sort of trial use of an XDAI network dApp, and then go to ideamarket.io and sign up for the Arbitrum chain, which will give you a little taste of a roll-up based dApp. So Anuraj is showing both on the screen. But yeah, anyway, just wanted to mention that continued hands-on stuff. But more comments on the scaling stuff?
Can you explain what you mean by creating a profile on Colony?
I think you can just sign in with your wallets set to the XDAI chain and create a profile and claim a name. I think you can claim a handle. I did this a while back, so I've forgotten the exact process, but you should be able to create a profile, choose a handle, and pay a little XDAI to like claim it. So try it. If it doesn't work, we'll do another session on it.
I don't see the place where I do that.
Okay. Fine. Let's see. Is there a Connect wallet or something?
In the upper right corner, I think you hit launch DApp.
Oh yeah, you have to do that first. And then if you're not on the
Well,
XDAI
now
chain,
connect the
it'll ask
wallet.
prompt you to connect wallet. Yeah, Anuraj is doing it on the screen. Yeah. So if you connect your MetaMask, so the Meta colony is the colony of the colony team itself. So it administers the software project, but it uses its own software. And, anyway, so just
Venkat,
something to try. And yeah.
I'm that far up, but I don't. Did you already create a landing place for us, or do we just
No,
need
I
to
haven't
do this
created
next
anything
step?
for us.
Okay.
I just thought a couple more people joining the Meta colony. I think the profile is for the Meta colony. It's because there's a distributed app. It's not that the identity is shared across all colonies. But why don't we sort of table this to a future session where we'll explore colony itself? But I just wanted to flag that. And the ideamarket.io sort of basically buy stock in people whose ideas you like. I'm actually listed on there. So any bloggers and writers and stuff. It's by a friend of mine. Okay. All right. So any other comments? Comments wanted to say something?
I just want to say, Jenna, if you click on that silly little picture on the upper right corner, one of the options is get started, and then he lets you create a user account.
Super.
Thanks, Mayor. I had created an account, I don't know, a couple months ago. So I already had an account. It was unclear to me beyond reconnecting my wallet. Was there another step that Venkat wanted us to take today?
I think you can claim a handle, and I think that requires some XDAI, but I'm not sure. It's been a few weeks since I did this. That's part of the reason I sent some of you XDAI in case we needed it.
I did that. Yeah, they were giving out XDAI a couple months ago, and I grabbed my handle then.
Okay. And yeah, there's multiple places to get XDAI. There's like faucets and things. If you just want small amounts to do
Yeah.
1 or 2 transactions, you can get it. And but if we start experimenting with Colony itself, many things will require XDAI, so it's good to have some handy. But okay, yeah, I think Commits has been holding something to say. Okay.
Nothing too major. I just I think one of the things that is interesting about the L2 solutions, particularly the optimistic rollup, is the way in which it has the potential to change our relationship to temporality in respect to the blockchain. So, I mean, obviously, like, you know, when we make a transaction with Ethereum, for example, there is this kind of like 20-second period before the transaction, or 10 or 20-second period, I can't remember which, before the transaction, the first block is made with that transaction. And then generally you have to wait a couple blocks before it's like fully confirmed by the application. But then like once it's like sent, like you can do whatever you want with that. With the optimistic rollups, there's basically something like a week-long period, which gives this time window for individual actors to watch the chain and look for any fraudulent transactions that have been submitted in the rollup, and then put down a bond and go through a dispute process. And actually, the bonding mechanism for like, and then like how they like deal with that fraudulent transaction is really interesting. But like, there's like this week-long period where like you can't actually like use the transaction because it's still in this kind of holding zone. And there's a mechanism for people who need to withdraw that transaction quickly to, I think they like pay a fee in order to like draw it down into, I don't know if it's drawing it down into the L1 because like the data is already in the L1. The transaction is just executed at the L2. So I'm not sure exactly like what the like technical mechanism is, but they're then allowed to, you know, withdraw and use that money, that asset, immediately once they pay a certain price. So there's like there's I guess it's like two things. One is like that kind of like incentive or like that ability to like to spend quickly, I think is like a potential kind of like watch flag or something for like future kind of traffic jams and like the like priority lanes. Like you might want to add like a lane to the like this highway metaphor for like people who are like highly lucrative and liquid and can like pay to like privatize, like have their own private lane with a toll booth or something. um so just to kind of expand that metaphor, and also I just wonder like how our sense of like the speed and time and like the idea that we might be working on a lag, like a week-long lag potentially, like in service of optimism, seems like an interesting dynamic to think about.
You know, this is actually something that's been occurring to me while reading about blockchain stuff in general, is that for all the emphasis on speed, it's kind of remarkable then to a certain extent there's a lot of it that seems to be pushing towards a slower, almost more deliberative pace of things. And I think there's a real interesting tension in the community between kind of like what people want and the way the technology seems to want to push things. And I don't really have a fully formed thought, but it's something like it keeps bubbling up for me in conversations, you know, with what Commits was just saying when I'm doing readings, that there's a different, it's almost a slower pace to these things.
That's kind of a really insightful comment. And just as you made that comment, a potential explanation occurred to me, which is when we say that the blockchain is kind of fast, we are actually making a comparison, an implicit comparison to human-powered bureaucratic organizations. So for example, if you go on a business trip and then you have to file an expense report, then a couple of middle managers approve it, and then it shows up maybe in your next paycheck or as a separate check for your travel. So that might take weeks. So compared to that, if, for example, we do a DAO with a smart contract for reimbursements, it might take like, just days if you do it the right way, and you'll get your reimbursement in coin. But once we are interacting with a purely computer system, somehow unconsciously, I think our frame of reference and comparison shifts from like the bureaucratic human organization we are replacing that takes weeks, and we start comparing it to like, purely online computational systems that do different things but operate much faster. For example, you post a tweet, it goes there in microseconds, and you get your likes and retweets like within minutes, right? So you're making the wrong comparison for a new kind of application. So I would say it is much faster than the thing it's replacing, but if you think of it as a computer, it looks slower, but then it's a computer that's doing very different things than the computers you're used to using before. So something like that might be going on. It's like we're shifting scales of abstraction and frames of comparison. So it's both slow and fast.
Not for me. I'm just comparing it to the responsiveness of a web server, the standard distributed service provider.
Yeah, but those typically don't provide things like this. Like, simply transferring money, for example, when I do an interbank transfer through ACH or something, it takes a couple of days to arrive. And now, like on Saturday, when we were experimenting with this stuff and Jenna needed some Ethereum to cover her signature, it took seconds for me to do that. Like that would not have been possible if we were working with the banking system. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. It may be slower compared to the distributed web server systems you're used to, but it's doing different things that Web 2 systems can't do.
No, you're justifying that if you have the processing being done by elephants walking up and down a hill, it's fast. But I send email, you get it 5 seconds later, 10 seconds later. I send you information, you send me a picture of a check. These things happen immediately. I'm not talking about the 2 weeks where, not just a
I
second, the
know.
4 weeks of
But
escrow.
for those, use email and send me a picture. I mean, why would you use the wrong tool for a task it's not adapted to? Blockchains are not a replacement for all the Web2 functions. They're, in my opinion, they're like a next generation that builds on top and extends the functionality of the existing
Well,
internet.
Not exactly. If we have a smart contract, which is basically acting as a manager instead of the CEO, we can't let it go slowly. It has to be able to apply the smart contract and do what the smart contract says at the normal speed of doing business.
So that's where more scaling solutions will come in. If you want certain decisions very fast, like an escalated decision that the CEO might take in an emergency within like minutes because maybe a factory is burning down or something, I don't know, then yeah, you would have equivalent mechanisms, I think, emerging in blockchain. And Kamit's just mentioned one where, privileged people might skip the 2-week roll-up optimistic slow pace of doing business and might pay extremely high gas fees to do the transaction on mainnet really fast. And you can already do that. Like on Ethereum, you can pay high to speed up. And this is equivalent to a CEO jumping on an executive jet and flying to an emergency site, which is a very expensive way to do big decisions more quickly, right? So I'm just trying to like calibrate expectations by comparing to the right things at the right level.
So I gave a bad example. A line manager. Okay, we have a factory, we have a line manager. There's a failure in some machine, he turns on another machine, he moves workers from one place to another. These are all things we expect to be done by a smart contract. We don't have to be, big guns like a CEO. Any line manager makes decisions all the time, makes them quickly, they have an effect within minutes. That's
I'm
what
going to
I'm.
have to hop off in a second, but I just want to interject 2 quick observations. One is a little bit in support of Venkat that, even with the line manager example, like eventually you could imagine like it's maybe slower than a web server, but it could still might still have something that reacts faster than a person, and there's a huge realm there. But the second thing is, I think some of what might be going on is there's kind of a trilemma here between energy use, time, and having a certain level of assurity. I guess you could say security in sort of in a integrity sense from the CIA triad, so sort of integrity of transactions of the ledger. Like you could probably do something that's like fast and has integrity, but then it's going to use a lot of energy. You could do something that doesn't use a lot of energy, but then it has integrity, but then it's not going to be fast. I'm not sure you can get all 3. And I'm just thinking of like cryptographic primitives like password hashes. Like part of the point of a lot of these hashes is that they are slow. And they're mathematically designed to be slow, and that's actually what gives them some of their security guarantees.
All right. In the interest of time, since we only have a couple of minutes, I was hoping to get to the proposals discussion. But why don't we take those offline? So if you look in the proposals channel, there are 2 things that require votes. So we are still doing very informal votes and things. So please read those proposals and vote on them. And if you have questions, we can start a thread to discuss either or both of them. So proposals channel, there's one proposal for me to transfer the dollars I'm holding for the Yak Collective into DAI, the stable coin, and hold it on chain. That way it becomes part of the multi-sig custody model. And the other proposal is to approve a split contract that the online governance group discussed a couple of weeks ago on how to set up the NFT for our first governance paper. And that proposal is there. So please vote on that and comment and discuss. All right. So, and I think next week, let me look at the page. I can't read very clearly who's next week.
It's supposed to be me.
Oh, okay. So Mayor will be leading a session on something next week.
Yep.
All right. See you guys next week, and let's continue this discussion in the blockchain governance channel. I think it's an important one.
Peace out.